Welcome to Advocacy Exchange, Navigating Injury Texas Law.
Hey everyone, welcome back to an all-new episode of Advocacy Exchange, Navigating Texas Injury Law with Paul Littleton. I am your host, Mike Leon. Paul is the Director of Business Development and Operations over at the Littleton Law Firm, where he helps guide strategy, client communication, and case management all across the firm. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about why early investigation plays such a critical role in injury cases and how timing can really shape everything that follows. Paul, it's good to see you as always. So when an injury case first comes in, what does that early investigation actually involve besides obviously gathering some basic information?
Well, thanks for having me, Mike. First, to answer your question, the initial investigation involves a lot of footwork. So typically, even if there's not a police report per se, we can definitely do things like request 911 recordings, because a lot of times, in fact, most times, there are a lot of people that will call in a crash, but they won't stay. There are things like the event data recorder or EDR recorder that can be collected from the vehicle that can give us insight in terms of which sensors went off first and the amount of pressure that they felt, whether or not the car was accelerating or braking, whether they have their turning, their wheels, where they were, what direction they were going, that kind of thing. There is cell phone information. If someone has been accused of having or being on their cell phone at the time of the crash, we can also collect that data from the carrier itself with, the permissions, therefore. There are things like the EMS reports that can be collected early on to show what the EMS found at the scene, especially if there was anything recorded in terms of injuries. There are the diagrams, if there were police involved, the body cameras from the police officers that were there at the time of the crash. There is a lot of evidence, heavy footwork, witness statements, and things that you have to accomplish and to achieve and get their signature on after they give you the statement, that has to be done initially after an accident to really make the claim go through, especially if you're going up against a large commercial company that, like an 18-wheeler or some sort of commercial van, because they will move quickly to make sure that they get all things lined up in their favor. And if they don't have anything in their favor, they will move quickly to make sure they remedy the claim and get it resolved quickly without fair compensation.
Paul, we talked about timing in the pre-recorded statements episode. Why does the timing of an investigation sometimes matter just as much as what's ultimately uncovered in the investigation?
Well, because the timing is the most accurate account. That's when everything's the most fresh, right? The most accurate account of what happened. You're going to be able to kind of plot that out. A lot of times what we do is we have clients write down what happened, just so that that also is in our file to make sure that it matches up with everything, especially in cases where we don't have police reports. Recorded statements, like we had mentioned in the prior podcast, are one way that both the insurance company, as well as the firm and other parties, will use to navigate kind of what happened and co-align that with the evidence that they find. But the timing of it all is key, just only from the perspective of it's the most fresh in terms of everyone's mind. Now, the other thing is that the timing of it also matters in terms of the evidence, because there are certain statutory regulations that will require or release, for instance, government agencies from keeping records. Right. So, for instance, if you wait, 2 years down the road, the body camera footage from the officers may not be available because they don't have to keep it that long after a certain time period. So getting all of that stuff early on is going to be the best way to do it, just so that you can secure that evidence in its most genuine state.
Speaking of securing that evidence, what does delays do in an investigation as an accident happens? Right? How does that affect the availability or the reliability of some of the key evidence?
Well, a lot of times, what will happen is if you have a witness and the witness statement is not properly secured, meaning you don't have a signed copy of that statement from the witness indicating that this is what they said and did and account and everything is true, et cetera, et cetera. Like, for instance, if you don't have that, let's just say you have a witness. Oh, yes, Jane Joe saw the accident and she's willing to say what happened. 2 years down the road, Jane's version of the accident may have changed in her mind, right? This is not a forefront of her life, not a priority. And as a result of that, things can get confused. For example, 2 years down the road, if you're looking at it and the defense counsel asks the witness, well, what color car was my insured driving? And she says it was yellow and it was like neon green or something, right? Then that is going to just kind of weaken her testimony. The same thing with our client, or any party involved in the lawsuit. So the better off you are of securing those things early and in the most prudent way possible, then you're better off, because later on it's going to diminish greatly.
Yeah. To that end, how does early investigation influence how the insurance companies assess the responsibility and the exposure with respect to the case?
It's, and I say this all the time, it's presentation matters, right? If you're, I don't care how big of a firm or how small of a firm, if you're a firm that actively gets involved in every case from the onset and pushes the envelope to secure as much evidence as possible. Like for instance, we've done many times where we have gone to gas stations to try and talk to the owners about security footage that their stores may have secured. We have gone to neighbors for ring cameras, to see whether or not their cameras caught the accident, and been successful, a good 80% of the time. There's a lot of things moving on the ground can secure quickly. And if you have a firm that's willing to do that, it shows up to the insurance company that way. Then that insurance company understands that you have got it together and you're moving fast. And that definitely impacts their evaluation on the claim, on the liability decisions, because they don't want to be the ones falling behind in that. Because Texas Department of Insurance does have regulations about how they have to properly respond, how long they have to properly respond on a claim. And they have to match those things, because TDI not only punishes the carrier or the actual company, but they can punish the actual adjuster, because their adjuster's licensing is with Texas Department of Insurance.
When you look at cases that have changed directions, months down the line, how often can that shift be kind of traced back to the decisions that were made early on with respect to the case?
I would say almost 100% of the time. What you do at the onset of the case will affect everything that occurs from that point forward. But I have seen several times where clients will come to our firm and their prior firm didn't do any of those things. And even though it was clearly not the client's fault, we have a hard time proving it, because now the carrier has gotten their own evidence to back up, their insured story, and they're not willing to re-review things. And it takes a lawsuit to get everything overturned. That is a time consuming, money consuming, and unnecessary at its core. So definitely I've seen it on the reverse front.
Yeah. And let me ask you, more so on the early investigation. Talk about how it helps establish that context and credibility before we start seeing disputes over fault or even damages, before those actually start to arise.
When you initially call in a claim, you're speaking to a bunch of different representatives or agents or whatnot, and they're doing it's a call center, right? They're just taking down data. That first call to the adjuster, when that adjuster is assigned, is crucial, which is why our team focuses on that, very much, because that is, you're laying out the platform, the outline of the case. And so when you're speaking with the adjuster and you're letting the adjuster know, kind of where our client's position is and how the accident occurred, what our client's injuries were, what the past medical, relative past medical would
Right.
be for our client, whether or not where our client was coming from, it puts context into the adjuster's head. So I'm going to give you an example of when we had a young girl. She was involved in a motor vehicle accident, and she was coming home from working as a nurse at the local hospital. And as she was driving, she gets rammed. The other driver asserted, because she was young, he was an older gentleman, but because she was young or whatever, that she was intoxicated or had been drinking, and because who's going home at 2 o'clock in the morning but drunk drivers. And so the idea is they had put all of this, the insured had put all of this in the adjuster's head. Now, granted, the adjuster didn't have anything to prove that, but we had actually explained early on that our client was a nurse. She had just been off of work or whatever. And so that contrast brought the adjuster to understand her insured's bias much quicker, without so much of a fight, and allowed her the liberty to say, okay, I hear you, but let's focus on what really happened here. And that took a lot of edge off of the case, and we were able to get it resolved quickly, versus had we not said anything at all, and her have that in her head about what our client was going, where she was coming from.
So, Paul, it sounds like, starting the investigation process early will really make the later stages of the case more efficient, less reactive, and more proactive. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, 100%. I know a lot of law firms do not like to do property damage because it involves the liability question. But the liability question isn't just a simple yes or no. It is also the degree or impact that can occur that adds that value to the case later on. Because, I mean, there's so many variables in there, whether airbags went off, whether, you're short or tall, where you're sitting, how the seatbelt's sitting. I mean, there's so many things involved that it's very, very crucial to add those things early on in your investigation because it brings the value of your case and helps the client get through this without having to file a lawsuit and go, 2 or 3 years just trying to get compensated for something they went through.
Yeah. Well, Paul, as we kind of wrap on this episode, for someone that's listening to it and they've been injured in an accident, what would you want them to kind of understand about the early investigative steps that can quietly shape the strength of the case long before you get involved and negotiations start to begin?
So the one thing I would like everybody to remember is that the insurance companies, they plot out a process that seems very simple in its structure. But that process is designed to get people to point A to point B without any conflicts or, any points of contention so that the bodily injury evaluation is somewhat subsided. If you feel like they took care of you in the beginning, you're going to be less likely to come back with a lot of bills and everything for the medical later on. Now, the idea behind that is great. It's a customer service based plan that serves the functions of the insurance company to keep their margins down. But the problem with that is that it's too easy. And as a result of it being too easy, it's not specific enough because they don't want you to tell them everything. They want you to answer their questions. It's not a conversation, right? And because it's not a conversation, they don't get all the details that really do matter and that will impact you later on, whether you realize it now or not. So the best way for you guys to remember is to know that if the insurance company is asking you questions, they have reasons. And if it's not a conversation that really explored what happened as well as what you feel and what it potentially could be, then that's the time that you need to get an attorney or someone to represent you who does understand the process on the back end, not just the front end.
Yeah. It's great stuff as always, Paul. Thanks for the time and the insights and breaking this down for the audience. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of Advocacy Exchange, Navigating Texas Injury Law. If you've been injured in an accident, you want to understand how early the investigation can really affect the direction of your case, do me a favor right now. Visit the team over at Littleton Law Firm by going to littletonlawfirm.com to learn more, connect with Paul and the team. Do me one more favor before you go. Hit like, hit subscribe, leave a review, comment, share the episode with someone who needs to hear it. I am Mike Leon. We will see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.